Sometimes, the most unexpected meetings change the course of our lives. Two strangers, sitting on a lonely park bench, their hearts heavy with loss, find solace in each other's company. What begins as a quiet conversation on a rainy day blossoms into something neither of them anticipated. An unexpected love that teaches them that it's never too late to heal, to open your heart again, and to find meaning in the most unexpected of places. In a world full of passing moments, they discover that love can grow from the simplest of beginnings, and even the longest journeys are made one step, one conversation, one bench at a time. The empty bench. The park was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that only comes in early autumn, when the air smells faintly of leaves about to fall, and the world seems to be holding its breath. Birds chirped in the distance, the grass was still damp with dew, and the old iron bench near the duck pond stood empty, waiting. It had been waiting a long time. Martha had passed that bench for nearly 3 months now, each morning on her way home from the bakery. She never sat on it. Not once. She would glance at it, sometimes slow her steps, but always kept walking. Something about it felt too intimate, too still. Perhaps it reminded her too much of the quiet in her own home, now that Arthur was gone. She carried her paper bag with the warm croissants tucked inside, same as always, and her scarf fluttered in the breeze. She was 76, and moved with the grace of someone who had once been a dancer. Long ago, in a life that felt like another woman's. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her steps were slow but sure, and she wore a navy blue coat that used to be his favorite. Today, for reasons she couldn't explain, she stopped. Maybe it was the ache in her knees. Maybe it was the way the morning sun struck the pond and made it shimmer like stained glass. Or maybe, though she would never say it aloud, maybe it was loneliness, that old familiar companion, tugging at her heart with more insistence than usual. She sat down. The bench creaked beneath her weight, and for a moment she simply listened. To the birds, to the rustling leaves, to the faint sound of a jogger's footsteps far off down the path. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the bag and pulled out one croissant. She broke it in half and smiled sadly. "Still too much for one," she murmured. From the other side of the path, a man watched. He'd been coming to the park every morning, longer than her, though their paths had never quite crossed. His name was Thomas. He was 78, wore a flat cap, and had the kind of face that made you think he'd seen the world go to war and come home quieter because of it. His hands bore the marks of a craftsman, thick fingers, knotted knuckles, but he hadn't held a hammer in years. He saw her sitting there for the first time, and something in him stirred, something not unlike hope. Thomas had lost his wife, Claire, 5 years ago. After the first year of trying to live like nothing had changed, he began coming to the park. The bench had always been empty. That, in its own way, had comforted him. Until now. He walked slowly toward her, uncertain. Maybe she wouldn't want company. Maybe she just wanted to be alone. But something about the way she held that half-croissant, offering it gently to the air as if handing it to someone who wasn't there, made him brave. He stopped a few feet away. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, voice low, careful not to intrude. Martha looked up. Her eyes were soft and gray, like storm clouds in retreat. She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Only if you like croissants," she said. He smiled, and just like that, the bench wasn't empty anymore. Rain and a red umbrella. The second time they met, it was raining. Not a storm, just a soft, persistent drizzle that whispered on the leaves and tapped gently against the pond. The kind of rain that made most people stay indoors, but not Martha. And apparently not Thomas either. Martha had almost stayed home that morning. The arthritis in her hands was acting up, and the sky had already begun to darken before she left the house. But there was something about that bench now, something quietly magnetic. Since the day he had joined her, shared that croissant with such gratitude and gentleness, the empty silence she once feared had begun to feel less empty. So, she brought her umbrella, the big red one Arthur used to tease her about, saying it was so bright it could stop traffic. She had considered getting rid of it after he passed, but something about its cheerfulness had kept her from letting it go. She arrived at the bench a few minutes past 10 and paused when she saw him already sitting there, waiting, hands folded over a thermos. He looked up and gave a small wave, his flat cap damp from the rain. She smiled as she approached, the red umbrella bobbing above her. "Didn't think I'd find you here in this weather," he said. "I could say the same about you," she replied, sitting beside him, careful not to drip on him. "But I brought reinforcements." She tilted the umbrella slightly so it covered them both. It was a tight fit, but neither of them minded. Thomas poured coffee from his thermos into a small enamel cup and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it with a grateful nod. It was strong, slightly bitter, but warm. It settled into her bones like an old friend. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain. The world around them blurred into soft greens and grays. Ducks floated lazily across the pond, unfazed by the drizzle. A child in a yellow raincoat splashed in a puddle nearby before being pulled away by a patient grandmother. "I used to hate the rain," Martha said softly. "Always made me feel trapped. Arthur would light candles and read, but I'd just stare out the window." Thomas looked at her. "And now?" she smiled faintly. "Now, I don't mind it so much. Not when I have a good umbrella and company." He chuckled. Claire loved the rain, said it made the earth clean again. I never understood what she meant until after she was gone. Martha turned to look at him, really look at him, and in his eyes she saw something familiar. Loss, yes, but also memory, and something gentler beneath it. Recognition. It struck her, just then, how rare this was. Two people not trying to impress each other, not trying to fill the silence with noise, just sharing a small slice of time, just being. A breeze picked up, and she instinctively pulled the umbrella closer to shield him. He noticed. "You know," he said, "that umbrella might really stop traffic." Martha laughed, and it was a warm, full sound. It had been a long time since someone made her laugh like that. Rain continued to fall around them, but under the red umbrella, it felt like a different kind of morning. Softer, fuller, like a second spring after a long winter, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew something had shifted. The bench was no longer just a place to sit. It was beginning to feel like a beginning. Wounds we don't talk about. They never planned their meetings. That was the beauty of it. Every Tuesday, 10 o'clock, like clockwork. No phone calls, no promises, just two people who showed up. Quietly. Faithfully. The bench had become theirs. Now. Not in the way of ownership, but in the way a song becomes yours because of the memories it holds. On their third Tuesday, the sky was clear, the breeze light, and the world smelled faintly of cinnamon and dry leaves. Martha brought 2 apples, this time crisp, red, and freshly picked from her neighbor's tree. Thomas brought a book. He never opened it. They spoke more now. Nothing heavy. Favorite foods. A shared love for jazz. How neither of them could work the new self-checkout machines at the grocery store. The kind of gentle surface-level talk that floats like fallen leaves, harmless, unburdened. But on this particular Tuesday, the air around them held something different, thicker, like the silence was asking them to be braver. "I noticed you wear your ring," Thomas said, softly, eyes on the pond. Martha looked down at her left hand. The gold band was still there, thin and worn from decades of life. "I tried taking it off once," she said after a moment. "A year after Arthur died. I stood in front of the mirror and slid it off. My finger felt bare. I cried for hours. Thomas nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. I still talk to Claire, he admitted. Mostly at night. Out loud, sometimes. I ask her if she's watching over the garden. I tell her about the squirrels chewing through the bird feeders. I don't know if that makes me mad or just still married in my head. It makes you human, Martha said. They sat in silence for a moment. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that honors what's too heavy to speak quickly. You know what hurts the most? Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not the holidays or the empty bed. It's the small things, like pouring 2 cups of coffee without thinking, or reaching for someone who isn't there. Thomas turned to her. His eyes were wet, not from tears exactly, but from the way some memories live too close to the surface. I still set 2 places at the table, he said. Even now? She nodded. I thought I was the only one who did things like that. No, you're not. And there it was, the truth neither of them had dared to say before. They were carrying grief like an old wound that still ached when the weather changed. They were healing, but slowly, and not alone anymore. He didn't need to explain the details, not the final hospital visits, or the coldness of funeral homes, or the strange cruelty of having to cancel subscriptions and close bank accounts when the person you loved was no longer there. Some wounds weren't meant to be shared in specifics, but acknowledging they existed, that was enough. Martha passed him an apple slice. Thomas took it, their fingers brushing for the first time. Just a second, but it lingered. She looked at him, not with sadness, but with the soft gratitude of someone who had just unclenched a fist they didn't know they were still holding. Maybe, she thought, healing wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about remembering together. Tuesdays with her. By the 4th week, the park bench didn't feel like a public seat anymore. It felt like their place. Each Tuesday, without planning or calling, Martha and Thomas arrived. First it was coincidence, then routine. Now it felt like something more, like a quiet promise neither of them had spoken aloud. The world moved fast around them. Joggers with earbuds flew by. Children zipped past on scooters. The seasons turned their slow pages. But for Martha and Thomas, time on that bench stretched differently, softer, slower, sacred. They didn't rush conversation. They didn't fill every silence. Some days they spoke of small things, how the ducks had returned to the pond, how Martha's knees were stiff that morning, how Thomas tried and failed to bake bread over the weekend. Other days, they simply sat. It was on one such Tuesday that something changed. Not dramatically, but enough that both of them felt it. Martha arrived wearing a new brooch, a small silver locket in the shape of a leaf. It caught the morning light as she walked toward the bench, and Thomas noticed it right away. That's new, he said, smiling as she sat down beside him. She touched it gently. It was a gift from my daughter. Inside's a picture of Arthur and me on our wedding day. He didn't ask to see it. He just nodded, as if honoring it. She worries about me, Martha added. Thinks I'm alone too much. Are you? She thought for a moment. Less than I used to be. Thomas turned to her, and for the first time, he reached out. Not boldly, not romantically, but with quiet care, and rested his hand on hers. It was warm, steady, kind. She didn't pull away. Claire, and I used to sit on the porch every Sunday morning, he said. Just sit, no talking, just being together. Sometimes I miss the silence more than the sound. Martha smiled. That's how you know it was real. They sat like that for a while, 2 hands, wrinkled and veined, resting together on a weathered bench. The wind tugged at the trees, scattering yellow leaves like paper promises. A teenager passed by on a skateboard, glanced at them, then looked away. To him, They were just two old people in a park. But to Martha and Thomas, that moment was everything. Later, as the sun began to lower, Thomas stood and stretched. "Same time next week?" he asked, like always. But Martha didn't nod right. "Away this time." She looked up at him with a curious smile. "Would you like to come for tea instead?" Thomas blinked, surprised. Then, slowly, his face lit up with something that had been buried deep. A kind of joy that felt almost unfamiliar. "I'd like that very much," he said. She handed him a small piece of paper. On it was her address, neatly written in cursive. And, as he walked away down the path, she watched him go with a heart that didn't feel quite so heavy. That Tuesday didn't end at the bench. It had only just begun. The photograph in her purse. The following Tuesday, Thomas didn't go to the park. Instead, he stood nervously in front of Martha's front door, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the edge of the walking trail. Lavender, daisies, and something yellow he couldn't name. They weren't fancy, but they felt right. Real. He adjusted his cap, took a breath, and knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was, Martha, in a soft gray sweater and a pair of pearl earrings that caught the afternoon light. She looked like someone who had been waiting, but not anxiously. Like someone who hoped, but never assumed. "You came," she said, smiling gently. "I said I would." She stepped aside, and he entered. Her home was small, cozy, and full of warmth. The kind that can't be bought or decorated in, but lives in the corners of bookshelves, in the scent of cinnamon tea, and the softness of old quilted throws. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, faces from another time smiling into the present. They sat in the living room, two mismatched cups of tea between them, a plate of shortbread cookies on the table. Classical music played faintly in the background. It felt like a moment, suspended in time. Martha seemed quieter today. Not distant, but thoughtful. Like something was stirring beneath her calm surface. "I want to show you something," she said after a while, reaching for her purse that lay by the arm of the sofa. She opened it gently and took out a small, worn envelope. Inside was a black-and-white photograph, creased from being handled too often. She passed it to him without a word. He looked down. It was a picture of a young Martha, not much older than 20, standing beside a man who wasn't Arthur. They were holding hands in a garden, their eyes bright, their smiles wide. The kind of photo that captured the beginning of a story that never got its ending. "That's William," she said softly. "My first love. Before Arthur." Thomas looked at her, not with judgment, but curiosity and care. "We were engaged," she continued, "but he was drafted. Vietnam. He didn't come back. I was 21. She paused, watching the memory unfold in the space between them. "For a long time, I carried that picture with me everywhere, even after I married Arthur. Not because I didn't love Arthur. I did, deeply. But William, he was my first heartbreak, and the first person I ever imagined growing old with." Thomas handed the photo back gently, almost reverently. "We all carry someone," he said. She looked at him, grateful he understood without needing more explanation. "I suppose I wanted you to know," she said. "Before we get too far into whatever this is." He smiled, that warm, thoughtful smile of his. "Martha, I'm 78 years old. If I've learned anything, it's that hearts aren't houses with just one room. We carry love in layers. That doesn't scare me." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something deeper. Trust. They sat for a while longer, drinking tea and talking about the people they'd once loved, not as competition, but as threads that had led them here. Later, as he walked home, beneath the late afternoon sky, Thomas thought about that photograph. It hadn't changed the way he felt about Martha. If anything, it made her even more real to him, more whole, and in his own chest, where Claire's memory still lived, he felt a strange, comforting sense of peace. Love, he was learning, didn't run out. It simply made room. The day he almost didn't come. Tuesday arrived, gray and heavy with rain clouds. Martha sat on the park bench alone, umbrella in hand, her fingers gently worrying the edges of her scarf. It was nearly 10:30. Thomas was never late. Not once. She told herself not to worry. He was probably just caught in traffic. Or maybe he'd decided to stay home because of the drizzle. But something felt off. The last time they spoke, they'd ended with laughter. She had told him a story about her granddaughter trying to make sourdough bread for the first time, and how the dough had exploded in the oven. He had laughed so hard, he'd had to wipe tears from his eyes. That's how they left it. Light, warm, connected, and now the bench beside her sat empty. She stayed for another 20 minutes, her eyes scanning every path, every figure in the distance, but he never came. That night, she made tea for two anyway. The kind with honey and cloves, the one he liked. She sat in her small kitchen, the second cup growing cold. The next day, still no word. She didn't have a phone number. She hadn't asked. It had felt too formal. Too much like they'd be anchoring something that should be free-floating. What they had was spontaneous, unspoken. A rhythm, not a contract. But now she felt its fragility. On Thursday, she walked to the bench. Again, though it wasn't Tuesday, she just needed to sit there. She brought the red umbrella, even though the sun was shining. It felt like part of the ritual now, a symbol of what they shared. She sat in silence, thinking, what if something had happened? What if he'd fallen? What if he was lying in a hospital room somewhere, wondering why she hadn't come, or worse? What if she never saw him again? And then, on the path ahead, a slow-moving figure, leaning slightly more to one side than usual, a flat cap, a familiar gait. Her heart lifted and ached all at once. It was him, Thomas. She stood quickly, tears already springing to her eyes before she could stop them. When he reached her, breath short and steps unsteady, he looked sheepish. I almost didn't come, he said quietly. She reached for his hand. What happened? He gave a tired smile. Took a spill on Monday. Nothing serious, just bruised ribs and pride. My daughter begged me to stay home, but I couldn't stand the thought of missing another Tuesday. She shook her head and held his hand tighter. You scared me. I scared myself, he admitted. Lying there on the floor, all I could think was, I never got to tell her how much those mornings mean to me. Silly, isn't it? No, she whispered. Not silly at all. They sat down together, slowly, carefully, his hand still in hers. For the first time, he leaned into her, not just emotionally, but physically, the way one tired soul leans against another, finding comfort in shared weight. And there, under the gentle sway of leaves and the memory of absence, they understood something neither had said aloud. This wasn't just friendship. It was the slow blooming of love, quiet, deliberate, and incredibly brave. Not the fire of youth, but the steady warmth of a fire well tended. When love wears wrinkles. The next Tuesday, the sky was clear, the air crisp with the first hint of fall. Martha arrived early, her steps slow but certain, and her red umbrella tucked under her arm as usual. She settled on the bench, and for a moment, she allowed herself to just breathe. It felt different today, lighter somehow, as though a weight had shifted. Thomas had been quiet the past few days, his movements more careful than usual. But he had insisted on coming today. Despite the lingering pain in his ribs, she could see it in the way he walked, a little slower, a little more cautious, but still determined to meet her, still eager for the time they shared. When he arrived, she smiled before he even reached the bench. There was something familiar in the way he moved, something that felt safe, like a memory she hadn't yet lived. "Morning," he said, his voice warm, but with the hint of something else, something deeper, a quiet vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. "Morning," she replied, standing to help him sit. He lowered himself carefully, his face momentarily tight with pain, but then he exhaled, letting the discomfort go as he relaxed into the bench. "I'll be fine," he said, brushing it off with a small chuckle. "Just a little slower than usual." She didn't comment on it, but she reached out and touched his hand, as she had done the week before. He looked at her in surprise, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Quiet, understanding passing between them. They didn't need to speak about it. They knew. They were growing older, both of them, with the occasional aches and pains that came with time. But it was the things that couldn't be seen that mattered now. The way their hearts had begun to intertwine, the way the weight of the past had softened between them. They had shared their losses, their regrets, their joys, and their memories. The years had given them the gift of understanding, of knowing that time was precious, not because it was limited, but because it was something they now treasured together. "You're quiet today," Thomas said after a while, his voice steady. "I'm just thinking," Martha replied, leaning back into the bench, her gaze drifting toward the pond where the ducks swam lazily. "I've been thinking about how we get older, and how the world keeps spinning even as our bodies slow down. And yet, we find ways to keep moving forward, don't we?" He smiled, a soft, knowing smile that spoke more than words could. "We do, even when we don't think we can." "I've been thinking about love, too," she added, her fingers tracing the edge of her umbrella. "The kind of love we have when we're young, and the kind of love we find when we're older. I think they're different, not less, just different." Thomas nodded, his eyes warm. "I think you're right. When you're young, love is all fire and passion. But when you get older, love becomes more about the little things, the touch of a hand, the shared silence, the comfort of being seen by someone who truly understands you. And it's funny," Martha said, her voice soft and reflective, "but it feels just as real. Maybe even more real than before." Thomas turned to her then, his gaze full of something she hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet longing, tempered by the years of loss and experience, but no less sincere. "Martha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I never imagined I'd find this again. A connection like this, with someone who knows the weight of time, the meaning of it." She smiled, her heart swelling in a way it hadn't for so long. "Neither did I, Thomas. Neither did I." They sat in silence for a while, watching the world pass by. The leaves fluttered on the trees, the ducks quacked as they paddled in the pond, and the occasional jogger or cyclist passed by, unaware of the two people sitting on the bench. Two people who had discovered something in the quiet of their golden years. When they finally stood to leave, Thomas hesitated for a moment, his hand on the back of the bench. "I'm glad we met, Martha. I'm glad we didn't miss this." Her heart fluttered, and she reached out, touching his arm. "I'm glad too. You've reminded me that love doesn't have to burn out. It can burn steady, and that's enough." He smiled again, his eyes soft with gratitude. "I think it might be everything." And with that, they parted ways, each carrying a piece of the other's heart with them, knowing that they were no longer just two strangers on a park bench. They were something more, something rooted in the quiet love that only time can nurture. The last bench, the days had grown colder, and the trees had shed their golden leaves. The crisp scent of autumn filled the air, and the park took on a quieter, more peaceful atmosphere. It was a season of endings and beginnings, and Thomas and Martha had learned, in their quiet companionship, how to embrace both. It had been months since they first met on the park bench, and in that time, Something deep and unspoken had settled between them. The shared mornings, the laughter, the stories of their pasts had woven a bond that felt both gentle and unbreakable. Their hearts, once filled with sorrow from years of loss, now beat together with a quiet, steady rhythm. On this particular Tuesday, the sky was overcast, the light dim, but the air still crisp with the last breath of autumn. Martha arrived early, as usual, and sat on the familiar bench. She had worn her scarf today, the one Thomas had complimented a few weeks ago, and she felt a kind of peaceful anticipation settle in her chest. She was no longer waiting for him to arrive. She knew he would. But there was a different kind of knowing now, something that came from the years they had spent together, from the quiet comfort they had found in one another's company. Azu, the Baitwaits. Minutes passed. She glanced up the path, half expecting to see him coming around the bend. But as time passed, a slow unease crept over her. Thomas was never late. Not once. She tried to push the thought aside. Maybe he had stayed up late with his daughter, or perhaps the weather had made him hesitant. He was getting older, after all, but the park was unusually quiet today, and she couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't quite right. A half-hour passed. Martha stood and walked slowly toward the path that led out of the park. Her gaze swept the benches, the trees, and the winding trail, searching for any sign of him. But there was no one. She could feel her heart quicken, a small knot of worry tightening in her chest. Turning back, she made her way to the oak grove, a place they had walked together often. There, sitting against the trunk of one of the old trees, was Thomas. At first, she thought he was simply resting, his cap tilted back, his eyes closed. But when she drew closer, a heaviness filled the air, a stillness that didn't belong. She knelt down beside him, her heart sinking as she gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thomas," she whispered, a tremor in her voice. There was no response. His hand, which had always been warm, was now cold. His breathing, usually steady, had ceased. For a long moment, Martha simply sat beside him, her hand still resting gently on his. The world around them seemed to slow, and a deep peace settled over her. He was gone. But it wasn't the sharpness of grief that filled her. It was something softer, something that came from the years of love they had shared. The quiet, steady affection they had built, one small moment at a time. It was a kind of understanding, a realization that, though he was no longer physically beside her, he had already given her everything she needed. Martha reached into her coat pocket and took out the old photograph of William, her first love, the one she had shared with Thomas months before. She held it up in the quiet space between them and smiled through the tears. "You were right, Thomas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Love doesn't burn out. It can burn steady, and that's enough." She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her heart wrapped in the warmth of the years they had spent together. She could hear the leaves rustling softly in the breeze, the world moving on as it always did. But in that moment, she felt a peace deeper than any sadness. She stood then, gently brushing the dirt from her coat, and as she did, a soft gust of wind blew through the trees. The leaves swirled around her, like the final gift Thomas had left her, a quiet reminder of everything they had shared. Martha turned and walked away from the oak grove, the photograph of William still in her hand. She knew she would always carry Thomas with her. In the quiet moments, in the shared memories, in the way he had taught her that love, even in its final form, could be enduring. And as she left the park, the sun began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows over the benches, over the place where they had once shared their first words, their first quiet smiles, and where, now, the memory of their love would remain.